This week, you continue your study regarding the science of social psychology. In this presentation, I'll address applying the principles of social psychology in working with your clients. Social psychology is the science of looking at how individuals engage, connect with, perceive events within their social environment, within their groups, their culture, society as a whole. Some of the relevant topics that you would explore when delving into this science would be social identity. In other words, topics of self-worth or self-esteem, the competency one feels or self-efficacy. You'll research the individual's attitudes and beliefs, because attitudes and beliefs become the filter for how information is interpreted, received, and how when those attitudes and beliefs are out of alignment with the information or the feedback being received, called cognitive dissonance. Clearly, our perceptions become our reality. Those assumptions, those prejudgments filter how we interpret the data, the situation. Emotions and mood play a huge role in perception. The social psychologist is looking at understanding or attributing behavior to causality. And so we're looking at the internal, the external factors which move behavior. That information helps us understand how to motivate and later how to persuade. Gender, often a relevant topic in how information is interpreted in subsequent behaviors. How individuals obey and conform to society, to groups, to their own cultures. And when talking about groups, how groups interact within the groups and between groups, and how conflicts arise, and perhaps prejudice, and how those conflicts might be resolved. And of course, the study how decision-making processes occur and how those decisions move towards action. So let's take a look at some of these issues, particularly how they pertain to working with our clients. So first of all, what is an attitude? Eagly and Share, attitude is a psychological tendency that is expressed by evaluating a particular entity with some degree of favor or disfavor. I think Boghossian does a nice job of kind of linking an attitude towards something to that psychological tendency. For example, the attitude towards other people might show up as a tendency of attraction, dislike, or disdain. The attitude towards a group could be an affinity to the group or perhaps prejudice against members of the group. An attitude towards an idea is an opinion. An attitude towards a job would show up as that satisfaction, dissatisfaction. Obviously, our attitude towards ourselves would be reflected in our self-worth, our level of self-esteem, perception. And towards services and products would show up as preferences and constraints. And clearly, that is directly linked to what we're working with our clients, because when, for example, we're working with wealth management, it's the idea of what asset allocation is appropriate given a certain need, risk tolerance, time horizon, and the client's preferences and constraints. So what might be some of those preferences and constraints? Might be an investment risk attitude, a desire to overweight in a foreign security, for example, or a certain market. The preference to maintain a standard of living, regardless of how that preference impacts maybe the optimal savings amount. Constraints Clearly, cash flow constraints when it comes to helping clients plan to achieve their goals. A constraint against investing in a company that might be socially irresponsible, even if it does have a high dividend. In an article which you may have read in a prior class, Risk Pack by David Cordell, he described the assessing a client's risk tolerance in respect to 4 variables, and 2 of them you could see attitude towards risk, that ability to tolerate more volatility, and that other one, propensity, which is past behavior. In other words, how has the client invested in the past? When you put 2 of those together in combination with financial capacity and also knowledge, then the author suggested that that gives us a better understanding of the client's real risk tolerance. Beliefs and values. David Myers, in his textbook Social Beliefs and Judgments, wrote, "We view our social world through the spectacles of our beliefs, attitudes, and values." Those personal convictions, those ideals that we value, clearly create that filter. As I briefly alluded to in that second slide, when our beliefs and assumptions are out of alignment with the information we're receiving, then that creates a cognitive dissonance. In other words, a disconnect there, and people in general are going to try to resolve that inconsistency, and they do that by maybe justifications, changing the value that's being placed on what they're seeing, maybe discrediting some of the information coming back, because that is that belief persistency, that tendency of people in general to resolve disconnects between those strongly held beliefs, values, and attitudes and what's being received. Well, how would this play out in our work with our clients? When I thought about belief towards money, 6 of the major areas that kind of jumped out to me was, well, what's our clients' belief about financial markets? Do they think the financial markets, we need to be there? They are going to, over time, certainly help the saving situation, the retirement situation, or have bad experience or recent experience tended to make our clients believe that the market's just one big casino. That difference in belief clearly affects how we can help our clients achieve their growth requirements. What do they believe about debt? Is debt something to be totally avoided? Or is there the belief that, hey, there's some good debt which helps us, that might have tax benefits to it and helps us buy a asset with growth potential versus debt on a consumable. For example, a car, the moment you drive it off the lot, it is certainly depreciated in value. What's the client's willingness to hold risk? And possibly, if it's not, we realize that belief might come from a lack of understanding the risk-return relationship. The idea that we need to be able to hold an acceptable level of risk in order to get excessive return. That is a constraint, but then again an opportunity for us to revisit that and help our clients grow in that understanding of the relationship. What's our client's belief about diversification? What's their belief about investing overseas? And the emotional connect there. What's that spiritual aspect of money? Is money looked upon as something bad, the root of all evil? People are, rich people are greedy. Or in fact, is it the idea that it's good, there's benefit there for my family, it's the ability to give back to society. Personal values and beliefs also extend into, well, what's that belief about the dynamic of the family unit? For example, what's the obligation to caring for parents? This could really vary depending on the culture that you're talking to also. Or the number of children in the family, you get the idea. What's the level of financial support to be given to the child's education? This certainly comes into play when we're talking to our clients about funding education versus funding their own retirement. We can give all the logical arguments in the world, like you can borrow for schooling, you can't borrow for retirement. However, if it's a closely held value and belief that I am going to help pay or totally pay for my child's education because perhaps my parents did for me, that's a whole different discussion. Whole different way we need to think about addressing the persuasion of helping our clients fund that retirement. What our values and beliefs certainly come into the planning priorities. Sense of worth. Self-esteem is that feeling or a sense of self-worth. And that sense of self-worth is impacted by our feedback from those in our community, those at work. So it also comes into comparisons, appraisals, our own sense of success and failures, and self-efficacy, the feeling of being competent and being in control. So when I think about those images, I pulled this slide together in the sense that yes, our values and our beliefs help clearly set that foundation of who we are. We have the influence, the external influences of our society, our culture, our reference groups, the role that we play at home and at our workplace, our economic status, our income status, and likewise the internal issues, our personality, our age, where we are in the life cycle, perhaps our gender, our knowledge, all those values, beliefs, external variables, internal variables flow into our self-image, and our self-image is connected to self-esteem, self-efficacy. Cognitive dissonance, again, that idea that people seek consistency in their beliefs and perceptions and act in ways to eliminate inconsistency. Change a belief would be one way, justify the behavior, reduce the value of the feedback, or discredit the feedback that's being received. I remember one time listening to a minister back in Boulder, Colorado, and he shared a story about a visiting monk. And an individual had approached the monk and really laid out just how horrible or just how stressful this person's life and the things that had gone wrong. And after listening to the person just spill out all this information, the monk had simply said this to that individual: if you want to change your life, just change your mind. And I've always remembered that because it's so powerful in its message, and I believe it's so true, because our interpretation, our mindset of the experiences coming at us is what is important. Not the items themselves, because it's our perception of those which really creates our reality. And part of our reality clearly is the preconceptions, our own expectations, our interpretations. And these preconceptions and expectations are influenced how we perceive, interpret, and remember information and events. Money tapes, our economic socialization, impact a lot of how we interpret financial feedback. Our before the fact judgments, and many times these ideas become self-fulfilling. Why? Because we attribute it to a way that aligns with these preconceptions, our expectations, even if those expectations are unrealistic. So as we think about this process of social psychology, clearly that helps us understand why a person would buy a service. And that links to attitudes, beliefs, values, and of course needs. It helps us understand how people receive and process information, the filters we talked about, how that impacts recall, interpretation. And it also, social psychology helps us get to how decisions are made and how those decisions can be translated into action. And as we think about how decisions are made, we go back again to prejudgments and also memories. So we're relying on ways that we've handled situations in the past, right? Priming is the idea of creating memory associations. And when those associations linked to a decision, linked to an action are primed, it increases the probability of that occurring. And that's where storytelling, I think, can come into play as a way to prime memory associations, connect to an action that would be beneficial to that memory. Heuristics, which you study in behavioral finance, is that rule of thumb, that shortcut decision-making process, and that's really been based on the evolutionary development of the mind, right? And so heuristic traps in the financial, and I should say those shortcuts, those mindsets from when we really dealt with the physical environment. Now we're dealing with the financial market, but that kind of comes over. And some of the traps include anchoring, in other words, starting from some reference point for valuation, things we saw in the market before thinking, that's happening again. Our tendency to focus on selective recall, recent events, and helping us sort of coming up with decisions, our aversion to ambiguity, to avoid uncertainty, to lean towards the familiar when that might not be the best decision-making process, and seeing correlation where none exists. And I refer you back again to the work you did in behavioral finance as you think about these mental shortcuts. Clearly, emotion and mood play a huge role in the decision-making process. So emotion, as Klaus Scherer shares, is a dynamic process which typically has a beginning and an ending in a relatively short duration. Not always the case, but clearly in many cases the emotion. And three response components are the physical arousal, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, motor expressions, face, voice, nonverbal expression that we can read in our clients, and subjective feelings, for example, tension, stress, happiness, excitement. Mood, which is more diffuse, generally lasting a lot longer, and not necessarily elicited by one event or concrete event. So these two, emotion, mood, clearly play major factors in our clients' decision-making process. And when we think about emotional issues in investment behavior, we can think about regret, avoidance, fear, and greed, how that plays into the mindset, sentiment to an item, for example, an inheritance could have really a lot of sentimental value there, holding on to a home, family home, aversion to ambiguity again, and feelings like guilt, embarrassment, the feeling of responsibility. These all would have major impacts on decision making for our clients. Social psychology, again, the idea, there's a lot of studies, scientific inquiry into the decision-making process. And this is one you looked at last week, or at least we introduced this in the first pre-recorded, one of your initial pre-recorded lectures, and you're reading about it this week, that idea that we have those attitudes, those beliefs, that expectancy, value, expectancy of that positive value. We're looking at the perceived control over the event, and that subjective norm, looking at the impact on loved ones, community, family, that sort of thing, and how that all comes into play in the intention, and the intention then leads to behavior. or this goal process. We'll look at goals in just a moment. But these theories, again, are designed to help us think of what's going into the decision-making process. It helps us predict behavior. It helps us understand the different pieces so that when we get into motivation, get into persuasion, we can start to dig down into some of the core reasons perhaps for a certain behavior. Well, let's take a look at goals for a moment. In this paper by Fishbach and Ferguson, The Goal Construct in Social Psychology, the authors write, we define a goal as a cognitive representation of a desired endpoint that impacts evaluations, emotions, and behavior. But goals entail more than just the end states. They include a variety of behaviors, plans, and objectives to enable one to reach that end state. Now, your author, Bagozzi, shares this diagram in one of your chapters. It's also discussed in a lot more detail in their article, Goal Setting and Goal Pursuit. And in it, they talk about setting a goal and then forming consciously or subconsciously that intention to pursue the goal, then plan for that action, initiate the action, and then following that through the loop there. And I thought it would be useful to take a few parts and then go back to that article we just mentioned by Fishbach and Ferguson. So in those first two, goal setting and the formation of the goal intention, the two authors share these observations for goal setting. The end state needs to be desirable. There must be a motivation. So there's a value element there, but also an emotion element. Goals may consist of interconnected memories. So when you're thinking about that, brings up these memories and may be influenced by others. And that can bring those social norms, right? The goal intention now can be conscious or unconsciously adopting that goal, and that activation, that intent remains throughout the period until the goal is achieved. When you move on to action planning and action initiation, again going back to this article, Fishbach and Ferguson suggest that, well, in action planning, the end state is that reference point around the behavior is planned, and you can get into multiple goals, and that can be trying to get multiple goals, also the competition of goals. Clearly something we deal with in working with our clients. And with action initiation control, the author is sharing activation impacts goal relevant behavior, knowledge, the evaluation feedback mechanism, and emotions. So I thought that the two articles came together nicely to start to think about some of those elements: cognition, motivation, the emotional elements. And in working with our clients, clearly some of the issues with goals, lack of clarity, and that's a huge value that you bring to your clients in helping them clarify their goals, because that's going to impact then that that conscious decision to implement the goal. Goal prioritizations, now we're working with multiple goals, maybe constraints like cash flows, so how do they work out? Which ones are we going to start implementing now, or are we going to be maybe suboptimally implementing a number of those at this point in time? How do you deal with the multiple goals, and what about goals that are conflicting? For example, the client wants to be able to help their children move forward with their passions, their goals, but at the same time not help so much that they can let those go and just live off that money. You get the idea. So I think lack of clarity, goal prioritizations, dealing with multiple goals and sometimes conflicting goals, and all come into play. Well, let me summarize this brief discussion again by sharing the themes, the major issues, a lot of what this discipline is focusing on. Again, how the individual operates, gathers data, connects with emotionally and cognitively with society as a whole. And how these then really do flow over to our work that we do with our clients. These ideas will flow through the remainder of the course. And next week we'll take a look at leadership, and specifically gets into motivation, persuasion, the interaction between the leader and the followers, the planner and the client. And then we'll be looking at how these flow into specific situations. For example, helping our clients move beyond where they are now with risk tolerance. How do we help our clients, a couple, deal with conflict resolution? So, fascinating subject. I encourage you to continue on your own to explore this discipline of social psychology, even outside once you finish the course. Continue your work here. The more we understand about the way our clients think, receive information, process that information, interpret that information, and translate it into their own decisions, the more we can help them. Okay, we look forward to seeing you in the next presentation.